Picture a world where every stone laid across a river wasn't just about crossing water. It was a calculated move in a high-stakes game of power. Medieval bridges weren't merely feats of engineering. They were loaded with hidden messages, built to whisper secrets of alliance or scream warnings of distrust between kingdoms. Think about that for a moment. A bridge could look like a simple path, but its design often held the tension of an unspoken threat, the ghost of a broken treaty, or the fragile hope of peace. What if I told you that some of these bridges were deliberately designed to collapse under the weight of an army, or that others hid spikes beneath their planks, ready to impale anyone who dared cross uninvited? These weren't accidents of architecture, they were masterclasses in medieval psychology, where every beam and arch spoke volumes about the rulers who built them. Now consider the sheer audacity of a king who ordered a bridge to be beautiful yet brittle, a dazzling lure for enemies who wouldn't live to regret stepping onto it. Or the cunning of a lord who built a drawbridge that could be severed with a single blow, leaving invaders stranded mid-river. These bridges were more than wood and stone, they were chess pieces in a deadly game, where trust was as rare as gold and paranoia ran thicker than mortar. And here's the thing, the choices these rulers made centuries ago still echo today. The way they built or refused to build reveals a truth about human nature itself. Fear doesn't just build walls, it sculpts entire landscapes, twisting function into deception and turning simple crossings into tests of loyalty. So why does this matter now? Because these forgotten bridges are time capsules, preserving the unspoken fears and ambitions of an era long past. They show us how power shapes the world, sometimes in ways so subtle we barely notice until we learn to look closer. Over the next few minutes, we'll walk across these ancient structures together, decoding their secrets one stone at a time. You'll see how a single bridge could spark a war or seal a fragile truce, and how the ghosts of medieval politics still haunt our understanding of trust today. This isn't just a journey into the past, it's a mirror held up to the present, revealing how little has changed when kingdoms or people weigh the cost of opening a path versus the risk of leaving one unguarded. Ready to step onto the bridge, let's begin. Take the Ponte Vecchio in Florence. On the surface, it's a charming row of shops over the Arno River, but look closer. Those towers weren't just for show. They were armed checkpoints, built because even a bridge lined with jewelers and merchants couldn't escape the shadows of medieval politics. Every stone was a negotiation, every arch a treaty in disguise, and this wasn't unique. Across Europe, bridges became silent diplomats, their designs broadcasting messages louder than any herald's proclamation. A wide, unbroken span, that was a king's handshake, an invitation to trade and travel, but a narrow bridge with a fortified gatehouse, that was a ruler saying, "Come if you dare, but know we're watching." Consider the fortified bridges of France, like the Pont Valentré in Cahors. Its three towering gates weren't just defensive, they were psychological warfare. Each step an enemy took across that bridge meant passing under arrow slits and murder holes, a constant reminder that hospitality had limits. Meanwhile, in England, the old London Bridge was studded with buildings and the heads of traitors. It wasn't just a crossing, it was a billboard for the consequences of betrayal. These rulers understood something profound. A bridge could be both a hand extended and a fist clenched, depending on who approached. But the most fascinating designs were the ones that played both sides. The bridge at Avignon, for instance, famously ended in midair after a storm. But some historians argue its incomplete state was strategic long enough to welcome pilgrims, yet short enough to strand an army. That's the genius of medieval bridge diplomacy. It wasn't just about being open or closed, it was about leaving just enough doubt to keep enemies guessing. Because in a world where trust was currency, sometimes the smartest move was building a bridge that could vanish at a moment's notice. There's something almost theatrical about a drawbridge, the way it could rise or fall like the curtain on a stage, revealing either welcome or warfare. But behind that dramatic motion was cold, calculated deception. Take the Château de Coucy, where the drawbridge wasn't just a door, it was a trapdoor. With a single command, the heavy wooden platform could vanish, leaving attackers stranded on the wrong side of a moat, or worse, plummeting into a pit of spikes. This wasn't just engineering, it was performance art designed to make invaders question every step. And that's the thing about drawbridges, their true power wasn't in their strength, but in their unpredictability. A bridge that could disappear at will sent a message louder than any battle cry. You are never safe here. Now imagine you're a medieval scout reporting back to your lord about a rival's castle. You'd mention the walls, the towers, but the drawbridge, that's where your voice would falter. Because unlike static defenses, a drawbridge was a wild card. Some were rigged to collapse under the weight of armored knights, their timbers deliberately weakened to snap like twigs. Others had counterweight systems so precise they could drop an entire cavalry charge into a moat in seconds. The Bridge of Sighs in Venice might sound romantic, but in places like the Castle of Chinon, the only sighs came from enemies realizing they'd walked into a death trap. These designs weren't just about stopping attacks, they were about planting doubt. Why charge a gate when the ground itself might betray you? And here's where the psychology kicks in. A fortress with a moat was intimidating, but one with a drawbridge that was downright sinister. It turned every approach into a gamble. Even allies had to think twice, because a lord who could vanish a bridge might vanish his loyalties just as fast. That's why treaties between neighbors often included clauses about bridge access. A lowered drawbridge was trust made visible, a raised one, a declaration of war without a single arrow fired. The Chronicles of Burgundy tell of a duke who kept his drawbridge permanently raised, even for allies, until they swore oaths on relics. Paranoia, maybe. But also a masterclass in control. What's fascinating is how these tricks echo today. Modern security gates, biometric checkpoints, they're all drawbridges in disguise, balancing access with suspicion. Because the lesson of the medieval drawbridge wasn't just about defense, it was about the power of uncertainty. When your enemy doesn't know if the path will hold or collapse, you've already won half the battle. And that's the real genius of these death traps disguised as crossings. They didn't just keep people out, they kept them guessing. Now imagine walking across what seems like an ordinary medieval bridge, only to discover the path ahead suddenly stops dead, or worse, drops away beneath your feet. This wasn't just bad construction, it was a carefully crafted betrayal. Across Europe, certain bridges hid what became known as traitors' gates, secret passages or collapsing sections known only to trusted allies. Outsiders, meanwhile, would find themselves funneled into kill zones or stranded on false platforms. The most infamous of these was on London Bridge in the 12th century, where a section near the southern gate could be severed with a single lever pull, cutting off advancing forces mid-crossing. The message was clear: loyalty wasn't assumed, it was tested one step at a time. But London wasn't alone in this chilling innovation. Spain's Alcantara Bridge, built by the Romans but fiercely guarded by medieval kingdoms, had hidden alcoves where archers could wait unseen. From afar, the bridge looked open and inviting until the moment attackers reached its center. when arrows would rain down from what seemed like empty stone. And in the Alpine passes of Switzerland, narrow bridges were built with removable planks, allowing defenders to dismantle them piece by piece while fleeing, leaving enemies staring at a gap no horse or siege engine could cross. These weren't just defensive measures, they were psychological games. A ruler who built such bridges wasn't just preparing for war, they were broadcasting that no one, not even allies, could be fully trusted. What's revealing is how these designs mirrored the politics of the era. Treaties were often scribbled on parchment, but trust was carved into stone. A bridge with a traitor's gate wasn't just a structure, it was a living contract, one that demanded proof of allegiance every time someone crossed. Chroniclers wrote of lords who ordered these features added after a single betrayal, turning their bridges into monuments of paranoia. The Bridge of Sighs in Venice, famously romantic today, was originally designed with a secret staircase that led not to a lover's balcony, but to a prison cell. Even the act of crossing could be an interrogation, like the bridges in Burgundy, where the width of the path narrowed just enough to force riders to dismount, making them vulnerable to scrutiny. This obsession with controlled access speaks volumes about medieval power dynamics. In an age where oaths were sworn on relics and alliances shifted with the seasons, a bridge became more than a connection between two banks. It was a filter, separating friend from foe. Some historians argue these designs weren't just about defense, they were about control. A lord who could decide who crossed and how held life and death power over commerce, communication, even pilgrimage. The bridges of medieval Europe weren't just built to span rivers. They were built to span the fragile line between trust and treachery, and to remind everyone that one misstep could prove which side you were really on. Some bridges weren't designed to endure, they were built to fail. Picture a wooden span across the Rhine, its planks creaking underfoot, ropes fraying with every gust of wind. To travelers, it might seem like shoddy craftsmanship, but to the lords who controlled it, this was strategy in action. The Holy Roman Empire was riddled with these deliberately fragile crossings, left to rot just enough to be treacherous, but not so much that they collapsed entirely. Why? Because a broken bridge wasn't an accident, it was a bargaining chip. Every merchant or pilgrim forced to detour meant another toll paid, another favor owed, another reminder of who held the keys to the kingdom's mobility. Take the bridges along the Danube, where local barons would forget to repair flood damage for years. The result, trade caravans had to divert through their private toll stations, lining their coffers while the empire's central authority grew weaker. This wasn't neglect, it was economic warfare in disguise. Chroniclers wrote of merchants bribing guards to let them cross condemned bridges at night, risking their lives rather than pay exorbitant fees. And the lords, they turned a blind eye because a little lawlessness was a small price for the real prize, control. But the most telling examples were the feast day bridges, flimsy structures thrown up for royal weddings or truce signings, only to disintegrate months later. These weren't symbols of unity, they were performative gestures designed to placate enemies without granting them real access. The Treaty Bridge of Nuremberg, built to celebrate a ceasefire between warring dukes, famously collapsed under the weight of its own decorations before the ink on the treaty was dry. Coincidence? Hardly. It was a physical metaphor for alliances built on hollow promises. What's chilling is how these tactics mirrored the politics of the time. A sturdy bridge required mutual upkeep, a shared investment in peace. But a fragile one, it kept everyone dependent, forever scrambling for temporary fixes. That's why some rulers preferred ropes to stone. You can't rebel against a power that controls the only crossing, especially when that crossing might vanish tomorrow. In the end, these bridges weren't just about controlling land. They were about controlling hope, dangling the promise of connection while ensuring no one could ever take it for granted. If you think modern toll roads are expensive, medieval rulers took the concept to an entirely new level, turning bridges into financial garrotes that could silently strangle entire regions. Take Edward I of England, who didn't just collect tolls, he weaponized them. When Welsh rebellions threatened his control, he didn't only send armies, he tripled crossing fees on key bridges like the one at Conway, choking off the flow of goods until local merchants begged for mercy. This wasn't taxation, it was economic siege warfare where the battlefield was a ledger and the weapons were silver coins. The Pont d'Avignon offers an even darker twist. Built by the Pope's bankers in the 12th century, it became a financial noose around the neck of Provence. Merchants bringing wine or grain from the countryside faced tolls that changed like the wind, higher for rivals, lower for allies. But the real cruelty lay in the exemptions. Certain towns could cross free, creating divisions between communities, turning neighbor against neighbor for the privilege of avoiding bankruptcy. The bridge's arches might have framed picturesque views, but its ledger books told a story of deliberate starvation, of markets withering because the cost to reach them was rigged. And then there were the adjustable bridges, not in height but in greed. Along the Rhine, some toll stations had sliding scales of fees, posted in codes only the toll keepers understood. A merchant from a friendly city might pay 1 gold piece per cart, while a rival's goods were charged 10. The most insidious part, these tolls often targeted essentials: salt, grain, iron, making them not just profit schemes but tools to manipulate famine and industry. Records from Lübeck describe how the Teutonic Knights once inflated bridge tolls on timber, knowing it would stall shipbuilding in a competing port for years. What's chilling is how these tactics blurred the line between commerce and combat. A lord didn't need to burn a rival's fields when he could tax their crops into oblivion before they even crossed the river. Bridges became economic filters, sieving wealth and power into the right hands while leaving others destitute. The Chronicles of Ghent tell of a bridge toll so high it sparked a revolt not by peasants, but by wealthy guilds who realized too late that even gold can't flow uphill. This wasn't just about money, it was about dependency. Control a critical bridge and you didn't just collect coins, you dictated survival. That's why treaties often included toll clauses, and why some cities raised their own bridges rather than let enemies monetize them. Because in the medieval world, the deepest wounds weren't always inflicted by swords. Sometimes they came from a tollkeeper's outstretched palm and a ledger inked in blood. Beneath the arches of medieval bridges, shadows whispered secrets. The old bridge of Linz didn't just span a river, it concealed a labyrinth of chambers where travelers vanished for questioning. What passed for hospitality was often interrogation, with gatekeepers offering bread and wine while memorizing every detail of a visitor's accent, weapons, or cargo. These bridges weren't just crossings, they were intelligence hubs where the stones themselves seemed to lean closer to eavesdrop. Consider the guard towers studding the Pont Pietra in Verona. From their slitted windows, watchmen could clock a merchant's nervous glance or a courier's too casual stride. But the real genius lay in the architecture. Spiral staircases were built with uneven steps to trip up fleeing suspects, while echo chambers amplified whispers between conspirators. Even the bridge's statues had hollow eyes, peepholes for scribes to record names and destinations. This wasn't just surveillance, it was theater designed to make travelers feel watched even when alone. Then there were the guest rooms beneath bridges like Prague's Charles Bridge. Damp cells masquerading as lodgings where firelight flickered just enough to reveal a prisoner's tells. Chronicles tell of spies posing as fellow travelers, sharing ale while steering conversations toward troop movements or grain shortages. The most valuable intelligence often came from the unsuspecting, like the Milanese silk merchant who, after one too many cups of bridge keeper's wine, revealed his lord's secret alliance with Burgundy. By sunrise, that confession was en route to rival courts, carried by riders who'd crossed the same bridge hours earlier. What's chilling is how these tactics blurred hospitality and hostage-taking. The Bridge of Sighs wasn't just a romantic passageway. Its waiting areas were designed to disorient. Prisoners brought across it would lose all sense of direction, making escapes impossible. Meanwhile, in France, the Pont d'Avignon had hidden compartments where scribes transcribed conversations through ventilation shafts, a medieval wiretap. These bridges mastered a dark alchemy, turning everyday travel into intelligence gold. A dropped coin could reveal a foreign mint's new design. A muddy boot might betray an army's march through distant hills. Even the wear patterns on a bridge's planks told stories. Heavier traffic on the left side suggested right-handed guards, useful for planning an attack. In the end, every stone was a spy, every arch a vault of secrets, and the greatest trick, convincing the world they were just places to cross a river. The most cunning bridges didn't just defend, they lied. Take the Mono Bridge in Wales, where every arch looked identical at a glance, but one crucial difference hid in plain sight. Half of them were pure illusion. Those ornate stone curves, they bore no weight, added no strength. They were theatrical props in a deadly game of misdirection. Siege commanders would waste precious hours targeting these weak points, only to watch their battering rams swing harmlessly against solid wall. Meanwhile, the real structural arches, subtly reinforced with iron rods, stood untouched. This wasn't just architecture, it was psychological warfare carved in stone. But the deception went deeper. Some false arches concealed murder holes, disguised as decorative carvings until defenders rained arrows through them. Others cast shadows that made the bridge appear longer or narrower than it was, tricking attackers into misjudging distances. The Pont Scalagero in Verona took this further. Its famed triple arches were actually 5, with 2 hidden behind false masonry to confuse sappers trying to calculate where to plant explosives. These weren't design flaws, they were calculated traps, turning an enemy's scrutiny against them. Even more brilliant were the bridges that weaponized color. The Alcantara bridge's stones were deliberately mismatched. Darker patches implied weathering, suggesting fragile spots. In reality, those darker blocks were the hardest granite, while the pristine, lighter sections masked brittle sandstone. Invaders would aim for what looked like newer, stronger stone, only to find it crumbled under their siege engines. What's striking is how these illusions mirror medieval espionage tactics. Just as spies planted false maps or forged letters, engineers built lies into the very bones of their bridges. The Chronicles of Chester describe a bridge where every 7th stone was secretly hollow, allowing defenders to listen for enemy sappers tunneling below, a literal early warning system disguised as random masonry. These deceptions reveal a brutal truth. In the medieval world, survival wasn't just about strength, it was about controlling what your enemy believed. A bridge could be both monument and mirage, its greatest strength hiding where no one thought to look, because sometimes the best defense wasn't a thicker wall, it was making your enemy waste their strength on a shadow. Walk across any major medieval bridge, and you'd be stepping not just on stone but on scripture. Those crosses chiseled into parapets, they weren't merely blessings for safe passage, they were land claims carved in sacred geometry. Take the Devil's Bridge in Sayret, where the arches bristled with grotesque carvings of demons and twisted saints. To pilgrims, it might have seemed like a warning against sin, but to the local lord, it was a calculated signal to Moorish raiders: cross here and you answer to our God. This was spiritual warfare etched in granite, where every saintly figure doubled as a sentry and every crucifix served as a border post. The real power of these symbols lay in their ambiguity. A bridge adorned with the Virgin Mary could be read as a gesture of piety by day, but by night, it transformed into a territorial ledger. When the Bishop of Bamberg ordered his bridge lined with statues of the 12 apostles, he wasn't just funding public art, he was staking Christendom's claim on a river that had once been pagan frontier. The message was unmistakable. This water flows under heaven's jurisdiction now, and heaven conveniently collected tolls through its earthly representatives. But the most brazen examples emerged where faiths collided. Along the Tagus River, reconquered from Muslim rule, Christian knights rebuilt bridges with a deliberate flourish, embedding crosses into the keystones of every arch, ensuring each structural load-bearing point also bore the weight of religious conquest. Meanwhile, in Orthodox Russia, bridges displayed icons of local saints facing outward, their painted eyes forever watching for invaders from the steppes. These weren't decorations, they were divine surveillance systems. What's fascinating is how these symbols functioned as medieval propaganda. A traveler crossing the Rhone would pass under bridge chapels where frescoes depicted enemy armies drowning in rivers, a not-so-subtle reminder of which side divinity favored. Even repair records reveal the strategy. Accounts from Regensburg show workers were paid extra to carve deeper crosses after floods, ensuring the markings outlasted the weather. Because in the end, a faded symbol was like a neglected alliance, useless when the storm came. The true genius of this sacred branding, it made rebellion sacrilege. To destroy a bridge marked with saints wasn't just vandalism, it was heresy, guaranteeing divine retribution in the minds of the faithful. That's why so many treaty negotiations included clauses about bridge iconography, like the Pact of Strasbourg, where rival dukes agreed to replace their family crests with neutral angels, turning contested crossings into demilitarized zones under heavenly arbitration. Religion didn't just shape these bridges, it became their mortar. From the St. Benezet Bridge in Avignon, where the chapel's bells were rigged to sound alarms, to the Welsh spans where Celtic knots secretly mapped rebel supply routes, faith was the language every traveler understood. Because in a world where maps were rare and borders fluid, nothing said this far and no farther like a stone apostle staring down from the parapet, his weathered hand raised not in blessing but in warning. A bridge with a missing span wasn't an oversight, it was a power play in stone. That gap between crumbling arches, a deliberate no-man's land, forcing travelers to halt and plead for passage like petitioners at a throne. The Bridge of Sighs gets all the attention for its tragic lovers, but its true genius was in what it denied: visibility. Prisoners shuffled through its enclosed corridor couldn't glimpse the canals below, robbing them of orientation and hope. This wasn't just architecture, it was sensory deprivation, a way to break the spirit before the interrogation even began. Now imagine you're a medieval merchant approaching the Ponte della Paglia in Venice. The bridge stands whole until the moment guards lift a hidden section of planking, leaving you stranded mid-river until your papers are inspected. That physical gap became a psychological chasm, reinforcing who held the keys to movement. The Dukes of Burgundy took this further. Their guest bridges had removable center spans stored in guarded towers, turning every crossing into a ritual of submission. You didn't just pay a toll, you waited, exposed, while soldiers debated whether your business warranted the effort of bridging the gap. But the most chilling examples were the truce bridges built during ceasefires. These structures were left intentionally incomplete, with a central platform that could be slotted in for negotiations, then swiftly removed if talks soured. The Oder River Bridge between Poland and Brandenburg had such a feature. 5 meters of empty air that required both sides to contribute planks for any meeting. It was trust distilled into timber. If either party withdrew their section, diplomacy collapsed literally underfoot. Chroniclers wrote of envoys standing on opposite sides, shouting across the void while carpenters hovered with hammers, ready to dismantle the connection at the first sign of betrayal. These broken bridges reveal a brutal truth about medieval power dynamics. A complete bridge invited equality, two sides meeting as peers, but a fractured one. That preserved hierarchy. The missing stones weren't an obstacle, they were the point. When the Count of Flanders ordered his engineers to leave every bridge in his territory, one cart width short, he wasn't being cheap. He was ensuring no army could march across without his say-so, while still allowing single-file civilian traffic under watchful eyes. The strategy even shaped trade routes. Maps from the Hanseatic League show merchants would detour miles to avoid the gap bridges of hostile lords, even when those routes added days to their journeys. That's how potent these missing stones were. They redirected economies without a single drop of blood spilled, and perhaps that's the darkest brilliance of all. These rulers didn't just build barriers, they built dilemmas. Every traveler had to choose between the humiliation of begging access or the ruinous cost of going around. Either way, the bridge won, and so did the hand that controlled its broken span. The most terrifying sound in medieval warfare wasn't the clash of swords, it was the crackle of burning timber underfoot. Bridges designed to burn weren't just defensive measures, they were time bombs waiting for the moment diplomacy failed. Take the Rhine crossings of the 1400s, where entire sections were built from wood soaked in pitch and animal fat. To travelers, these spans looked sturdy, but guards kept torches ready at both ends, their flames reflecting in the river below like a constant, unspoken threat. One spark could turn a vital artery into a wall of fire in minutes, severing supply lines and trapping enemies mid-river. But why go to such extremes? Because in an age without phones or radios, fire was the ultimate communication tool. When Swiss rebels burned the bridges at Morgarten in 1315, the smoke columns became a signal heard across valleys, literally. Chroniclers wrote of farmers miles away seeing the glow and knowing invasion had begun. These weren't just bridges, they were alarm systems made of kindling. The real genius lay in the psychology. A flammable bridge forced everyone to consider the cost of betrayal. Merchants crossing the Elbe knew their carts might roll over wood that could vanish in flames before they returned. That uncertainty shaped behavior more effectively than any garrison. Records from Lübeck describe how Hanseatic traders would bribe bridgekeepers to store extra planks nearby, not for repairs, but as insurance against suddenly finding their route home reduced to ashes. Some rulers took this further, turning bridge fires into political theater. When the Duke of Burgundy wanted to humiliate a rebellious vassal, he didn't just burn their bridge, he invited neighboring lords to watch the spectacle from safe vantage points. The message was clear: cross me, and your connections to the world go up in smoke. Even truces acknowledged this power. The Treaty of Strasbourg included clauses requiring both sides to keep firefighting buckets chained to certain bridges, turning prevention into a shared responsibility. What's chilling is how these tactics blurred the line between defense and arson. The burn zones on London Bridge weren't accidents, they were carefully calculated gaps where flames would spread fastest, creating fire breaks to save the fortified towers. Engineers didn't just build bridges to last, they built them to burn precisely when and where it hurt enemies most. Because in the medieval world, trust wasn't just built, it was doused in pitch and left waiting for a spark. Nothing says, "Trust me," like a bridge unless that bridge was a gift between medieval rivals. The Karlov Bridge in Prague stands as a masterpiece of Gothic engineering. but beneath its statues and arches lies a darker truth. When Holy Roman Emperor Charles Roman IV gifted this bridge to the city, his engineers included a fatal flaw: secret cavities in the piers designed to collapse if explosive charges were ever planted. This wasn't generosity, it was geopolitical blackmail carved in sandstone. The message: accept our connection, but never forget who controls its destruction. Gift bridges were the ultimate double-edged sword. Take the one offered by King Matthias Corvinus to the rebellious city of Bratislava, a stunning span adorned with his royal crest. What locals didn't realize was that the decorative iron clamps binding the stones were deliberately undersized. Under normal use, they held, but during the king's siege years later, those same clamps failed under the weight of fleeing defenders, plunging them into the Danube. The chronicles are eerily silent on whether this was coincidence or calculation. The real treachery lay in how these flaws were hidden. Some bridges used mortar mixed with excess sand, weakening it over time. Others had keystones cut fractionally too small, so they'd loosen during floods. The most insidious were the smiling bridges, arches that seemed perfectly balanced until winter frosts exposed their uneven foundations, conveniently timed with military campaigns. A gift bridge wasn't just infrastructure, it was a countdown clock disguised as charity. What's chilling is how these deceptions mirrored the era's diplomacy. Treaties might promise eternal friendship, but the bridges built to celebrate them often had expiration dates. When Venice gifted Dubrovnik a bridge after a trade agreement, its wooden supports were secretly untreated against rot. By the time the beams failed a decade later, Venetian merchants already dominated the alternate routes. The lesson: in medieval statecraft, even concrete and stone could lie. These bridges reveal a brutal truth about power. Control isn't just about holding territory, it's about holding the illusion of generosity. A king might smile as he handed over the keys to a new bridge, all while keeping the schematic of its weak points locked in his treasury. Because the strongest alliances weren't sealed with gold or oaths, but with the unspoken knowledge that the path between two kingdoms could vanish with a single, well-placed hammer blow. Royal marriages might have been sealed with rings and vows, but the real test of commitment often lay beneath their feet, on the very bridges where they celebrated their unions. When Princess Maria of Hungary married Duke Wilhelm of Bavaria in 1487, their procession didn't end at a cathedral door. It halted mid-span on the Ludwigsbrück, where they exchanged garlands over the Isar River. The symbolism was unmistakable: two banks now bound by stone and sacrament. But what the cheering crowds couldn't see were the iron pins hidden in the bridge's central arch, pins that could be yanked out by engineers if the alliance soured, collapsing the connection as swiftly as a scribe could draft an annulment. This wasn't just ceremony, it was statecraft disguised as romance. Consider the marriage bridge of Valencia, built for the wedding of Ferdinand and Isabella's grandson. Its golden balustrades bore intertwined carvings of Castilian lions and Aragonese bars, a love story in stone. Yet beneath the gilding, the mortar was mixed with ground seashells, a deliberate weakness that would crumble in salt water. A poetic coincidence? Hardly. The design whispered a truth every noble understood. Dynastic marriages were temporary alliances, and even the grandest bridges might need to dissolve when politics demanded. The most revealing examples were the trial marriage bridges of northern Italy, where betrothed couples were required to walk across specially constructed wooden spans before their wedding. If the bridge held, the union was blessed. If it swayed ominously, the contract could be voided without shame. These weren't superstitious rituals, they were carefully staged stress tests for relationships that would determine trade routes and inheritance lines. The Chronicles of Milan describe one such bridge that collapsed under an overweight countess in 1492. sparing the city and disastrous alliance with her bankrupt family. Coincidence or calculated engineering? What's chilling is how these designs mirrored the era's legal loopholes. Just as marriage contracts included secret annulment clauses, bridges had their own getaway plans. The Pont d'Amour in Burgundy featured a decorative centerpiece that could be dislodged with a single hammer strike, while the Bridge of Sighs in Verona had a section rigged to tilt, sliding unwanted spouses into the river below. These weren't just architectural flourishes, they were prenups written in limestone. Perhaps no bridge better captured this duality than the one spanning the Tisa River for the wedding of King Matthias and Beatrice of Naples. Its stones were engraved with sonnets praising eternal love, but the foundation was laid on a bed of loose gravel. When the marriage faltered years later, the bridge sank unevenly, leaving Beatrice stranded on the wrong side during a diplomatic crisis. The chroniclers framed it as divine judgment, but the engineer's notes tell a different story. The gravel had been specifically chosen for its instability. In the end, these bridges weren't just metaphors for marriage, they were its mechanical counterparts. Every hidden pin, every weakened joint mirrored the fine print in royal wedding contracts, the quiet understanding that even the most glittering unions were built on contingency. Because in medieval politics, love wasn't blind. It was wide-eyed, calculating, and always prepared to burn the bridge behind it. Stone didn't just hold up bridges, it held up reputations. When Venice unveiled the Ponte di Rialto in solid Istrian limestone, it wasn't just showing off its wealth, it was staging a geopolitical performance. That pale, flawless stone, quarried from conquered territories, whispered two things to every merchant and diplomat who crossed it. We own the land beneath this river and will outlast your petty kingdoms. Compare that to the wooden bridges dotting Hungary's frontier, their timbers creaking with deliberate impermanence. These weren't just practical choices, they were tactical ones. A stone bridge declared dominance, a wooden one kept escape routes open. The real genius lay in how materials played both sides. Take the Pont Neuf in Paris, built with stone piers but wooden decking, a perfect metaphor for France's balancing act between Habsburg and Tudor ambitions. The stone said, "We're here forever." The wood added, "But we can burn our bridges if we must." Even the color of materials sent signals. The red sandstone of Heidelberg's bridge wasn't just pretty, it mirrored the local prince's crest, turning every arch into a heraldic banner. Meanwhile, Swiss cantons used unvarnished pine for their spans, broadcasting frugality as both virtue and warning. Attack us, and we'll vanish into the forests, leaving you nothing but kindling. But the most cunning material code came from the Baltic, where the Teutonic Knights built bridges with two faces, stone on the side facing Christian allies, rough-hewn timber toward pagan lands. It was architectural doublespeak, solidarity for friends, menace for foes. Chroniclers wrote of Prussian ambassadors refusing to cross certain bridges unless their side was properly faced, knowing full well the insult of being received on wood instead of stone. What's fascinating is how these choices mirrored the era's legal dodges. Just as treaties included sunset clauses, wooden bridges had built-in expiration dates. When King Matthias of Hungary needed to placate the Ottomans without angering the Pope, he ordered a temporary wooden bridge across the Sava, one that conveniently rotted just as tensions eased. Meanwhile, stone bridges became frozen diplomacy. The 12-arch monstrosity Spain built after annexing Portugal wasn't just functional, it was a chain of stone shackles, each pier stamped with the conqueror's crest. This material language even shaped espionage. Spies didn't just sketch fortifications, they noted bridge compositions. A report from English agents in Flanders meticulously described the mix of brick and flint in Antwerp's bridges. decoding which towns had invested in permanence versus those keeping demolition options open. Because in the end, the difference between stone and wood wasn't just about strength, it was about commitment and how loudly a kingdom wanted to announce it. Or conceal it. Some bridges weren't just built to be crossed, they were designed to be stolen. Take the Pont Vaillantrae's infamous one-sided staircases, spiraling upward with steps only accessible from the riverbank closest to the town. Attackers scaling the opposite tower would find themselves trapped on sheer walls, while defenders could retreat or reinforce at will. This wasn't just clever engineering, it was a real estate swindle carved in limestone, turning every siege into a rigged game of Monopoly where one player held all the dice. The sheer audacity of these designs reveals a brutal truth. Medieval warfare wasn't always about bloodshed. Sometimes the smartest generals won by letting their bridges do the fighting. Along the Loire, certain towers were constructed with doors that only opened inward, meaning once you seized them, no counterattack could dislodge you. The Chronicles of Blois describe how English forces once captured an entire bridge at night, simply by slipping through a toll gate, left slightly ajar by a bribed guard. By dawn, the French found their own fortifications turned against them, arrow slits now bristling with enemy crossbows. But the real masters of this game were the Venetians. Their bridges in Dalmatia featured hidden ladders behind decorative carvings, allowing defenders to vanish into the superstructure like ghosts, only to reappear behind advancing troops. The Bridge of Sighs might be famous for romance, but its lesser-known cousin, the Pont dei Squartati, earned its name Bridge of the Dismembered by having collapsible sections that could drop attackers into alleyways where waiting guards made quick work of them. What's chilling is how these bridges blurred the line between conquest and commerce. The Teutonic Knights built spans with toll booths that doubled as choke points. Merchants paying fees one day might return to find those same booths manned by enemy soldiers. The bridge's ownership flipped as easily as a coin. In Lombardy, certain arches were leased to different noble families, creating a patchwork of control where rival factions could literally hold different parts of the same bridge hostage. The ultimate power move, bridges designed to be more valuable to the enemy once taken. The stone spans of Aragon were deliberately built with wider ramps on the far side, knowing Castilian horsemen would prioritize capturing them only to realize too late that those broad approaches made perfect staging grounds for counterattacks. Why shed blood storming a castle when you could trick your foe into handing you the keys? These bridges weren't just structures, they were Trojan horses in plain sight. Because in the medieval world, the sharpest weapon wasn't a sword, it was the ability to make your enemy think they'd won, right up until the moment the drawbridge slammed shut behind them. Certain medieval bridges didn't just carry footsteps, they betrayed them. Walk across the Pont dei Sospiri in Venice, and the slightest whisper would ricochet off its curved walls, carrying secrets straight to the ears of hidden guards. This wasn't an architectural quirk, it was acoustic warfare. Engineers designed these spans to amplify sound with precision, turning every footfall into an alarm system. The higher the vault, the longer the echo, a trick borrowed from cathedral builders who'd spent centuries perfecting the science of sacred acoustics. Only here, the heavenly harmonies were replaced by the clank of weapons and the telltale scuff of boots. Take the bridge at Château de Pierrefonds, where the undersides of arches were lined with hollow tubes. To the untrained eye, they looked like drainage pipes, but they functioned as primitive amplifiers, channeling vibrations from the roadbed to guard chambers below. A single horseman crossing at night could sound like a thunderstorm to watchmen half a mile away. Even the materials played a role: limestone for clarity, sandstone for muffling, each chosen not just for strength but for how it carried sound. The Chronicles of Carcassonne describe sentries identifying approaching parties by the pitch of their footsteps on specific stones, a skill as finely tuned as any musician's ear. But the real masters of sonic surveillance were the Venetians. Their infamous Bridge of Sighs wasn't named for lovelorn prisoners. It earned that title centuries earlier, when guards realized its parabolic shape could catch and amplify conversations from 50 paces. Spy holes disguised as decorative rosettes allowed listeners to pinpoint voices, while the bridge's iron railings vibrated like tuning forks, transmitting whispers along their length. A merchant haggling over silk prices might unknowingly have his words carried straight to the Doge spies. This auditory engineering reached its peak in the singing bridges of Castile, where metal strips were embedded between stones. When stepped on, they produced distinct tones, high notes for light footsteps, deep drones for armored troops. Guards could literally hear an invasion coming in chords, interpreting the bridge's music like a coded warning system. The most elaborate examples had different sections tuned to different keys, creating a sonic map of movement across the span. A sudden shift from G minor to C major might signal a flanking maneuver, giving defenders precious minutes to prepare. What's chilling is how these designs weaponized trust. A bridge that sang was a bridge that listened, turning the very act of crossing into a confession. Pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago wrote of avoiding certain spans at night, fearing their prayers might be distorted into heresy by mischievous echoes. Even allies grew wary. Diplomats learned to draft treaties mid-river on boats, knowing the stones beneath them never forgot a word, because in the end, the most powerful bridges weren't the ones that connected kingdoms. They were the ones that whispered their secrets. The towering parapets of medieval bridges didn't just keep people from falling, they made them wish they could. Take Spain's Puente Nuevo, where the sheer drop between its arches wasn't an engineering oversight. It was a psychological trap. Invaders charging across would suddenly find themselves gripping the walls, their courage evaporating as they stared into a gorge so deep locals called it the throat of God. This wasn't just architecture, it was theater, designed to turn even the bravest knights into hesitant children, their armor suddenly feeling like a lead weight. But the real genius lay in the details. Those ornamental carvings along the railings, they weren't just decorations, they were optical illusions, zigzag patterns that tricked the eye into perceiving the drop as even more vertiginous. And the bridges with uneven walkways where one side sloped slightly downward. That subtle tilt forced attackers to lean unnaturally, their bodies betraying their fear before they'd even drawn a sword. Chroniclers wrote of besiegers abandoning assaults not because of arrows or boiling oil, but because their knees literally wouldn't carry them forward. Some bridges took this further, weaponizing sound as well as height. The Ponte della Maddalena in Italy featured hollow parapets that amplified the river's roar below, turning a crossing into a sensory assault. Imagine trying to shout orders over what sounded like a waterfall, while your horse panicked at the vibrations underfoot. Even the materials played a role: slick limestone for the upper edges, just smooth enough to make gripping them treacherous. The most brutal designs exploited primal fears. The Devil's Bridge in Sayret had gaps between planks wide enough to see through, forcing invaders to march while watching the distant river writhe beneath their feet like a living thing. Others, like the Ponte de Spagni, featured parapets that tapered inward at the top, creating a subconscious sensation of the walls closing in. These weren't just barriers, they were mazes for the mind where every step heightened the dread. What's chilling is how these tactics mirrored medieval torture techniques. Just as interrogators used cramped cells and precarious platforms to break prisoners, bridge designers weaponized disorientation. A force that paused mid-span wasn't just delayed, it was demoralized. its cohesion unraveling with every whispered joke about the drop. And that's the true power of these structures. They didn't just defend territory, they invaded the psyche, turning courage itself into the weakest link in the chain. Because in the end, the most effective walls aren't made of stone. They're built from the unshakable fear that the next step might be your last. Crossing the Kremmerbrook in Erfurt wasn't just a journey, it was a test of survival. This medieval bridge didn't just span a river, it twisted and turned like a serpent, its sharp-lined path narrowing suddenly into choke points barely wide enough for a single cart. To attackers, it was a nightmare of dead ends and blind corners, where every step forward could mean walking straight into a volley of crossbow bolts from hidden loopholes above. But the real cruelty lay in the illusion of safety. Those charming half-timbered houses lining the bridge, their upper floors jutted outward, creating overlapping kill zones where defenders could rain death from 3 directions at once. This wasn't just architecture, it was a predator's playground dressed up as a marketplace. The genius of these labyrinth bridges wasn't in their complexity, it was in their deception. Take the Pont de Rialto's earlier wooden incarnation, where the planks were laid in zigzag patterns. To the untrained eye, it looked like shoddy craftsmanship, but the truth was far more sinister. That irregular path forced invaders to break formation, their shields useless as they twisted to navigate the turns. Meanwhile, archers stationed in the bridge's towers had clear lines of sight down every straight section, turning the structure into a giant shooting gallery. Even the materials played tricks. Darker wood on certain curves created shadows that hid tripwires and caltrops scattered by retreating defenders. Some bridges took this psychological warfare further by weaponizing memory. The Pont Saint-Bénézet in Avignon featured nearly identical arches, but one crucial span was slightly narrower, a detail only locals would notice. Attackers rushing across would instinctively slow at this bottleneck, creating a traffic jam of terrified soldiers perfect for incendiary arrows. Others, like the old London Bridge, used recurring motifs in their carvings to disorient. Those repeated saintly faces weren't just devotional, they made it impossible to gauge progress mid-charge, leaving enemies exhausted before they'd even reached the far bank. The most brutal innovations emerged from siege experience. After the Mongols overran a Hungarian bridge in 1241 by following fleeing townspeople, engineers began incorporating false refuge alcoves. These niches offered apparent shelter, but their curved backs amplified screams, a feature the Ottomans later exploited by lining similar alcoves with iron to create echo chambers of dying men's cries. The Bridge of Sighs might be famous for romance, but its lesser-known cousin in Nuremberg earned the nickname the Groaner for its sound-magnifying murder holes. What's chilling is how these designs exploited basic human instincts. The labyrinth wasn't just walls, it was a carefully orchestrated assault on spatial awareness. The Kremmerbrook's irregular cobblestones, for instance, weren't uneven by accident. Their varying heights forced attackers to look down, breaking their line of sight with defenders. The bridge at Orleans took this further, using subtly sloped sections to make invaders feel like they were charging uphill even when the path was level, a trick that left entire battalions gasping for breath mid-assault. These bridges didn't just defend cities, they rewired the brains of those who crossed them, turning courage into confusion and strategy into panic. Because in the medieval world, the deadliest traps weren't hidden in dungeons. They were hiding in plain sight, masquerading as the very paths meant to connect us. Prague's Charles Bridge didn't just span the Vieltowa. It was a propaganda reel carved in sandstone. Every statue lining its parapets served as a carefully scripted episode in the Holy Roman Emperor's greatest hit, Bow Before My Magnificence. Take the towering figure of St. Vitus, placed strategically near the old town entrance. To pilgrims, it was a holy protector. To locals, a not-so-subtle reminder that their patron saint answered to imperial authority. This wasn't just art, it was psychological branding, where every chisel mark reinforced who held heaven's favor and earth's power. The real mastery lay in the sequencing. Crossing the bridge became a forced pilgrimage through Charles Roman IV personal mythology. First, you'd pass St. John of Nepomuc, the martyr famously thrown into the river for defying a king, a warning disguised as devotion. Next came the Pieta, its sorrowful Mary whispering of sacrifice for the empire. By the time travelers reached the far side, they'd absorbed 30 sculptures worth of imperial messaging without realizing they'd been indoctrinated. Even the bridge's alignment was propaganda, built to frame Prague Castle at the perfect angle, so every glance upward reinforced where true power resided. But Prague was just one act in this medieval PR campaign. In Florence, the Ponte Vecchio's glittering goldsmith shops weren't there by accident. They were the Medici's flex, proof that commerce flowed where they allowed it. The bridge's famed Vasari corridor, a hidden passageway above the shops, let rulers surveil both the river and the economic pulse below. Paris took it further. The Pont Neuf's equestrian statue of Henry Roman IV wasn't just a tribute, it was the first royal likeness ordinary Parisians could touch, transforming monarchy from distant concept to tangible presence. The most brazen examples weaponized scale. London Bridge's 19 arches weren't necessary for crossing the Thames. They were a mathematical middle finger to rival kingdoms, shouting, "Our river's so wide we can afford to waste stone." Meanwhile, the bridge of Alcantara's inscription, "I will stand forever," wasn't architectural pride. It was psychological warfare against Moorish neighbors, declaring Christian permanence in recently conquered land. Even repairs became theater. When the Bishop of Avignon ordered his bridge rebuilt after floods, he made sure every new stone bore his coat of arms, turning disaster into a billboard for divine favor. These bridges didn't just connect banks, they connected minds to messages. The statues, the width, even the mortar mixes were focus group tested by the ultimate medieval influencers. Kings who understood that the surest path to control wasn't through swords but through symbolism. Because when you can make subjects kneel in awe before a bridge, getting them to kneel in court comes easy. The stones didn't just hold weight, they held narratives, and woe to anyone who dared read between the lines. There's a reason England's Devil's Bridge earned its name not from any pact with hell, but from the terrified whispers of spies who never made it across. These so-called haunted bridges weren't just folk tales, they were psychological minefields where superstition served as the deadliest border guard. Take the one in Kirkby Lonsdale, where locals swore the ghost of a betrayed mason pushed trespassers into the river. The truth, that ghost was likely a network of hidden levers rigged by the town watch, designed to tilt certain stones underfoot. A clever spy might spot a patrol, but who'd suspect the very bridge beneath them was an accomplice. The real genius of these legends was how they weaponized belief. In Wales, the story went that no mortal could build such a perfect arch over the turbulent river Leda. Only the devil himself could have engineered it. What better way to keep prying eyes away than by convincing them the crossing was cursed? Night watchmen leaned into the theatrics, leaving eerie lanterns flickering near the water's edge or scratching unholy symbols into the stone. The effect was chillingly effective. Chronicles from Chester describe captured infiltrators confessing they'd taken mile-long detours just to avoid bridges where the dead walked. But the darkest secrets weren't supernatural, they were bureaucratic. Those same bridges rumored to be haunted often had meticulously kept ledgers hidden in abbey vaults, listing every soul who'd paid the toll. A missing name could mean a spy, and sudden, ghost sightings conveniently coincided with crackdowns on smuggling rings. The Bridge of Sighs in Venice might be famous for its prisoners, but lesser-known spans like Germany's Hexenbrück had a far quieter purpose. Their witch marks were actually coded tallies, tracking which merchants were overcharging for grain during famines. What's fascinating is how these myths evolved alongside real engineering. The devilish groans reported at Cornwall's St. Nectan's Glen, likely the sound of hidden floodgates being tested. The phantom lights over Yorkshire's Ribblehead Viaduct, probably signal mirrors reflecting distant watchfires. Even the legend of trolls under Scandinavian bridges served a purpose. Those trolls were often tax collectors in disguise, waiting to ambush travelers avoiding daylight toll booth. The ultimate irony, some bridges became so infamous for their hauntings that rulers had to debunk their own myths. When Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Roman II needed to send diplomats across the Teufelsbrück in the Alps, his engineers publicly exercised it by reinforcing the arches with conspicuous iron bands. The message was clear: the devil might build bridges, but only an emperor could make them safe. And that's the real horror lurking in these tales. They weren't just stories to scare children, they were camouflage for the brutal calculus of power, where fear kept the secrets even stones couldn't hide. The Pont d'Arc didn't just cross a canyon, it laughed in the face of gravity itself. This staggering natural arch, carved by the Ardèche River over millennia, became a medieval power play when local lords built a road directly across its spine. Think about that for a second. Rather than constructing a bridge, they commandeered a geological wonder, turning nature's architecture into their personal highway. It wasn't just a shortcut, it was a billboard screaming, "We don't conquer landscapes, we recruit them." But the real flex wasn't in the crossing, it was in the timing. Engineers waited until summer droughts narrowed the river below to a trickle, then hauled stones up the cliffs under cover of darkness. By the time rival nobles noticed, the road was already functional, its existence proving their neighbors' mastery of both terrain and logistics. Chroniclers wrote of visiting dignitaries refusing to cross, not out of fear, but sheer disbelief that anyone could build where even birds hesitated to nest. Other rulers took notes. In Portugal, King João Roman II ordered a bridge slung between two sea stacks at Cabo da Roca, a spot where Atlantic winds howled with enough force to peel paint from wood. The construction took 7 years and claimed dozens of lives, but the payoff was priceless. Suddenly, a kingdom known for fishing boats controlled the only safe passage along a lethal coastline. Merchants who'd once sailed past Lisbon's ports now had to pay tolls or risk the cliffs. The psychological impact of these impossible bridges rivaled their engineering. When the Dukes of Burgundy spanned the Rhône at Tournon with a single parabolic arch in 1489, they didn't just connect two banks, they rewrote the rules of reality. Peasants whispered that the devil must have lent his tools, while rival architects tore up their plans in despair. That was the point. A bridge that defied physics became a self-fulfilling prophecy of invincibility, its very existence making rebellion seem futile. Even failures served a purpose. The unfinished bridge of Cordoba, abandoned mid-construction after a caliph's death, became a tourist attraction for medieval travelers. Its skeletal arches looming over the Guadalquivir whispered a different kind of threat. We could have done it and might still. Sometimes the most powerful statement wasn't what you built, but what you proved you could build. These spans did more than connect points on a map, they redrew the boundaries of ambition. When the Republic of Ragusa built a bridge across the Ambla River's subterranean estuary, they weren't just solving a transportation problem. They were demonstrating that even water flowing underground couldn't escape their control. That's the alchemy medieval rulers mastered, turning stone and mortar into pure political theater, where every arch was an act of defiance against the limits of the possible. The lesson written in these stones: true power isn't just about controlling land. It's about convincing everyone else that the impossible was always yours to command. Imagine stepping onto a bridge where even a whisper could land you in chains. The Pont del Tet in Venice wasn't just a crossing, it was a soundproofed prison in disguise. Its infamous silence law didn't just discourage chatter, it turned every footstep into a potential crime scene. Guards patrolled with ear trumpets, their brass funnels amplifying murmurs from 20 paces away, while the bridge's curved walls bounced voices straight to hidden listening posts. This wasn't urban planning, it was psychological warfare waged with acoustics. The real terror lay in the unspoken rules. Merchants knew better than to discuss prices mid-span, lest a rival report them for suspicious bargaining. Lovers learned to communicate in touches, not words, after a notorious incident where a nobleman's daughter was caught reciting poetry to her suitor, a transgression that earned them both a week in the Doge underwater cells. Even gondoliers developed a system of hand signals, their oars tapping cryptic rhythms against the piers. The bridge didn't just connect Venice's red light district, it severed the most dangerous connection of all: unmonitored conversation. But why such draconian measures? Because this particular span led directly to the city's financial heart. Tax collectors crossing from the Rialto could be overheard revealing assessment strategies. Ship captains might let slip cargo manifests before officials could tally the tariffs. The chronicles mention a black market ledger seized in 1523, its pages filled with transactions recorded in bridge span sign language, until a guard noticed the suspicious lack of lip movement. The most chilling aspect wasn't the enforcement, it was the self-censorship. Regulars developed bridge faces, blank expressions that gave nothing away. Visitors learned to save their breath, literally, after a German merchant famously turned purple holding in a sneeze rather than risk a fine. The stones themselves seemed to absorb sound, their porous trachyte soaking up secrets like ink on parchment. What's haunting is how these tactics persist today. Modern surveillance cameras and wiretaps are just high-tech versions of Venice's whispering walls. The Pont del Tet may be gone, but its legacy lingers wherever power seeks to control not just movement but thought itself, one silenced step at a time. Those inscriptions chiseled into the Alcantara Bridge weren't just historical footnotes, they were legally binding contracts set in stone, quite literally. When Roman engineers carved, "I built this for all mankind," across its arches, they weren't making a poetic gesture. That phrase was the ancient equivalent of a terms of service agreement, declaring this crossing open to all, provided they recognized imperial authority. The real genius lay in what wasn't written. Notice how the dedication plaque sits precisely at eye level for mounted riders. That positioning was intentional, forcing every passerby to acknowledge the bridge's ownership before continuing their journey. Some inscriptions went beyond mere declarations. The Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the New World between Spain and Portugal, wasn't just signed on parchment. Key clauses were etched into the pillars of bridges along both kingdoms' borders. These weren't copies for public display. They were the actual legal documents, their permanence reinforcing that territorial claims couldn't be washed away like ink on paper. When floods damaged the Pontevedra Bridge in 1522, diplomats scrambled not to repair the structure, but to recover the treaty fragments before rival scribes could misinterpret the gaps. But the most cunning inscriptions played visual tricks. Certain bridge treaties used alternating deep and shallow carving techniques. The obvious text spelled out generous terms, while shadows revealed harsher conditions at specific times of day. A merchant crossing at noon might see promises of free passage, but return at dusk to notice the phrase "between sunrise and sunset," now visible through clever shadow play. The Bridge of the Three lies in Prague took this further. Its foundation stone bore 3 contradictory dates, ensuring any legal challenge would collapse under the weight of its own confusion. Hidden clauses often lurked in plain sight. The Pont d'Avignon's famous children's rhyme actually encodes toll exemptions for certain guilds. The number of times on the bridge repeats corresponds to tax-free crossings for wool merchants. Meanwhile, the supposedly decorative swirls on Regensburg's Steinenbrück, those were medieval QR codes, readable only to toll collectors with cipher wheels, detailing which shipments required special inspections. What's chilling is how these stone contracts manipulated perception. The massive letters proclaiming "Eternal Peace" on the Lahn River Bridge were deliberately placed where sunlight would bleach them whiter than surrounding stone, a visual metaphor for purity that crumbled when winter rains revealed older, darker threats underneath. Some inscriptions even changed meaning with water levels. The Loire bridges, low water clauses, only became legible during droughts, conveniently absolving lords of maintenance obligations precisely when peasants needed repairs most. These weren't just messages to the present, they were traps for the future. When archaeologists recently scanned the Alcantara Bridge with 3D imaging, they discovered indentations too shallow for human eyes to notice, designed to erode into visibility over centuries. The original builders weren't just thinking about their own reign, they were planting legal landmines for descendants to uncover, ensuring their will would outlast their dynasty. Because in the end, the most enduring power isn't held by those who write history, but by those who carve it in stone that weathers all storms. The Pont dei Solti didn't just cross the river, it fought back. This medieval marvel in Switzerland's Verzasker Valley wasn't built to stay still. Its arched spine was designed to sway like a dancer, throwing off the precise marching cadences of invading armies. Picture hundreds of soldiers attempting to cross in lockstep, only to find the bridge subtly rocking beneath their boots, their disciplined advance dissolving into chaotic stumbles. This wasn't an engineering flaw, it was a calculated weaponization of physics, where motion became mightier than any sword. The genius lay in the bridge's flexibility. Unlike rigid stone spans, the Pont dei Solti used slender arches and lightweight materials that responded to rhythmic pressure. When footsteps synchronized, as they naturally did in military formations, the bridge would amplify the movement, creating a feedback loop of instability. Chroniclers wrote of Habsburg troops abandoning assaults not because of arrows or boiling oil, but because their own marching drums had literally shaken the ground from under them. Even the bridge's nickname, the Leaper, hinted at its defensive secret. Crossing required an almost playful adaptability no armored column could replicate. But motion wasn't just a disruptor, it was a psychological tool. The bridge's gentle oscillations played tricks on perception, making distant towers appear to sway like mirages. Attackers already dizzy from the crossing would reach the far side disoriented, their battle plans crumbling faster than their balance. Some historians believe this was no accident. The bridge's designers may have studied ship decks, borrowing techniques sailors used to destabilize boarding parties. The effect was ruthlessly effective. Records from Milan describe a French battalion so unnerved by the bridge's movement that they accused local witches of hexing the stones. Other regions took note. In the Pyrenees, rope bridges were deliberately left slightly loose, forcing invaders to crawl single file like insects. The Welsh went further, building spans with irregular gaps between planks that compelled attackers to break stride with every step. These designs exploited a universal truth: armies march on rhythm, and without it they falter. The Pont dei Solti's greatest innovation wasn't stopping invaders, it was making them defeat themselves, one misstep at a time. What's fascinating is how these bridges turned nature into an ally. Wind, water vibrations, even the weight of birds could set them subtly quivering, creating a constant low-level unease. Like a sentient creature, the bridge seemed to learn from each crossing, its movements growing more unpredictable with use. Modern engineers analyzing the Pont des Saltés found its arches behave like tuning forks, resonating at frequencies that disrupt human equilibrium. The builders may not have understood the science, but they mastered the art, proving sometimes the best defense isn't a wall, but a question mark carved in stone and air. These dancing bridges whisper a lesson we've forgotten. True strength isn't always about rigidity. In a world obsessed with fortresses, the most brilliant defenders built structures that flowed like water, bending but never breaking. Because in the end, the surest way to topple an enemy isn't to meet their force, it's to dissolve it into the rhythm of the river itself. The most terrifying bridges in history were the ones that never existed, at least not for long. Imagine watching your enemy's army materialize out of thin air, crossing a river on a bridge that hadn't been there at dawn, only to vanish again by nightfall, leaving no proof but the carnage in its wake. These were the phantom spans of the Mongol Empire, pontoon bridges lashed together from raided villages' timber and stolen boats, designed to carry thousands of horsemen across any obstacle, then disappear without a trace. Unlike stone monuments that boasted of conquest, these fleeting structures were the ultimate tools of deniable warfare, turning rivers from barriers into ambush routes. The Mongols didn't just build bridges, they weaponized impermanence. Their engineers could assemble a crossing in hours using prefabricated sections carried by spare horses, lashing them together with horsehair ropes that dissolved in water if abandoned. No stone towers, no toll houses, just a whisper of planks that left no archaeological footprint. When Subutai led his forces across the frozen Danube in 1241, his scouts first tested the ice with portable reed mats to muffle the sound of hooves. But when rivers weren't frozen, that's when the real artistry began. The chronicler Juveni wrote of bridges appearing overnight near Kiev, built from the very houses Mongol sappers had torn down upstream, their lumber repurposed into a path for destruction. By sunrise, the army had crossed. By noon, the bridge was kindling for their cookfires. What made these vanishing acts so devastating was their psychological toll. A stone bridge could be besieged or sabotaged, but how do you defend against a crossing that might appear anywhere at any time? The Hungarians learned this too late when Batu Khan's forces floated bridges on inflated sheepskins under cover of fog, bypassing fortified crossings entirely. And the Mongols weren't alone in this spectral strategy. Venetian commandos used collapsible silk rope bridges to raid Dalmatian coasts, while Japanese ninja clans employed woven vine spans that could be rolled up and carried away after a night of assassination. But the Mongols perfected the art, turning rivers into accomplices. The true brilliance lay in the aftermath. Unlike permanent bridges that invited counterattacks, these phantom spans left enemies chasing shadows. After the sack of Baghdad, survivors swore the Tigris had opened like hell's jaws to swallow the caliphate because no intact bridge could explain the Mongol cavalry's sudden appearance inside the city walls. Modern archaeologists still debate whether some raids used bridges at all, or if the Mongols manipulated perception so thoroughly that witnesses imagined crossings where none existed. That's the ultimate psychological victory, when your enemy starts doubting the very ground beneath their feet. These ghost bridges whisper a chilling lesson about power. The strongest walls mean nothing if your foe refuses to play by the rules of permanence. While European kings squabbled over tolls and masonry, the Mongols rewrote the game, proving sometimes the deadliest path isn't the one carved in stone, but the one that vanishes behind you like smoke on the wind. These bridges were conversations in stone, each arch a sentence in a silent negotiation between kingdoms. Think about that. What we now see as picturesque ruins were once loaded with meaning. Every cobble a chess move in a game where the penalty for misreading your opponent could be annihilation. The Ponte Vecchio's golden shops, the Charles Bridge's saintly statues, even the Devil's Bridge's eerie legends, none were accidents. They were psychological operations as calculated as any battlefield maneuver. Consider the modern Golden Gate Bridge or the Millau Viaduct. They're marvels of engineering, sure, but they're also statements. One screams American optimism in international orange. The other floats like a French daydream over the Tarn Valley. The language has changed, but the subtext remains. Every bridge still tells a story about who built it and what they value. The difference: medieval engineers didn't have press releases. They had keystones carved with threats and drawbridges that doubled as traps. Here's what's haunting: we still navigate the shadows of those ancient suspicions. Ever notice how airport security gates resemble medieval choke points? Or how blockchain, the ultimate trustless system, echoes Venetian bridge ledgers designed to prevent fraud? The tools evolve, but the human dilemma stays the same: how to connect without being vulnerable. So next time you cross a bridge, pause mid-span. Feel the weight of history beneath your feet. That's not just concrete or steel, it's the accumulated cunning of centuries, whispering that every hand extended can also become a fist. The stones remember what we often forget: architecture isn't neutral, it's power made visible. If these echoes of the past fascinate you, drop a comment below. What modern structures do you think carry hidden messages? And for more journeys into the secrets woven into our world, hit subscribe. The past isn't done talking, we just have to learn how to listen.